Welcome back, my friends. In part one of this video series, we looked at how breath shapes the nervous system, how it influences our physiology, how it is an interface between the environment and our state. Not just when we're doing breath work, but the 20, 25,000 times a day we're typically breathing, right? This constant input, this master regulator of the entire system. But today, we're going a little bit deeper, right? Because breathwork isn't just this baseline tool that shapes, right? It can also be used as this kind of intentional tool to create, right? Not just a tool of restoration, but also a tool of transformation, right? In this video, what I want to explore is how the use of intentional breathwork creates these altered states of consciousness, right? What's happening in the brain? What's happening in the body? Why are people able to have these big cathartic experiences and release emotions, right? So that we have a clear understanding of both the functional, restorative side and the experiential or therapeutic side. Because when we really see breath as this kind of like tool that spans across this spectrum, again, we can start to see why it is such a powerful tool. So what happens when we do breath work, right? So what I'm talking about here really falls into the realm of typically breathing harder and faster. I'm actually going to bring up a little whiteboard as I walk through this, because typically that's going to help us kind of understand a little bit easier. So when we begin to breathe, as I mentioned, kind of a little bit faster, a little bit deeper, we begin to immediately impact physiology. Really simply, as I increase my breath, I decrease the amount of CO2 that is in my system. Now, CO2 plays a really important role. It is what's known as a vasodilator, right? It influences the relaxation of blood vessels. So it tightly controls blood flow. And where it tightly controls blood flow is largely, you're going to get to see my drawing skills here, the brain, right? Not a very good brain, but we're going to run with it, right? I'm going to point out some key parts here. But so we have blood flow coming into the brain from the heart, okay? When we begin to manipulate the breath and we manipulate how much CO2 is in the system, we start to impact the dilation of blood vessels and therefore blood flow. As blood is entering the brain, right, this reduction of blood flow happens to create a little bit of a kind of rerouting. Right? The brain, pretty intelligent. Some have called it the most complex system in the known universe, right? The brain is pretty smart. So when we have a reduction of blood flow coming in, i.e. a reduction in energy and resources, the brain starts to decide, what do I need to shut down and what do I need to keep online? Okay. The prefrontal cortex is the part of our brain that, it's called the executive function, executive decision making. It's where the voice in my head, what I'm telling myself, right? Referencing the past and the future and justifying and ruminating and judging and all of the stuff, right? The voice in the head. The limbic system is a deeper structure in the brain. It's kind of the seat of our emotions, our fears, largely involved in the autonomic nervous system. And then we have kind of the brain stem back here, which largely controls the kind of like keep me alive functions, right? Keeps my heart beating, keeps my breath moving. So if we kind of think of these three parts of the brain, when we start to reduce the blood flow coming in, which is happening when we begin to hyperventilate, right? The brain goes, you know what's not kind of critical right now is the prefrontal cortex. That big thinking part of the brain that uses a lot of my energy, right? It's a big usage, right, of the energy that's coming in. It's not kind of necessary to keep me alive per se. So we're going to shut that down and we're going to reroute the blood flow back to the limbic system and the brainstem. These are more important brain structures when it comes to keeping us alive. Now, where this gets super interesting, I'm just going to have to erase a little bit. I get excited when I draw and I take up a bit of space. Where it gets really interesting is what happens when we knock out the prefrontal cortex and we kind of bring more activation, energy, resources to the limbic system. So think of this, right, as a bit of a gatekeeper. I'm not going to bring up that emotion because it might be painful. I'm not going to express this. I'm not going to move my body this way. I'm not going to cry. I'm not going to yell, right? Because what will people think? It's very self-referential, right? This is going to make me stand out, or it's going to make me be seen, or it's going to, diminish my spot in the tribe, like all this hierarchical stuff that's built into our nervous system. The prefrontal cortex is kind of like the gatekeeper, right? When we knock that out and we allow the limbic system to kind of run free, it's like we open this door and out comes all of the stuff, right? All of the stresses that we're holding on to, all of the emotions we haven't addressed, all of the charged memory, right? All of the stress physiology, all of the unclosed loops that have been open in my nervous system have this opportunity to come out, because the gatekeeper's not there being like, keep all that shit in, right? We don't want to address that. We don't know what to do with it. We don't want to have to go there because it's painful. Whatever that reasoning is, we got rid of the gatekeeper and we open up, right, this access point for stuff to come up. There's the really neuroscience technical term. The analogy I really like to use is taking a mental emotional shower. Most people shower every day or every couple of days. Why? Well, we kind of like accumulate some dust and some dirt, and we're out and about, there's germs, right? We shower to keep ourselves clean. Most people don't take a mental emotional shower, right? They're accumulating all this debris in the form of stress and overwhelm, right? They're accumulating all this debris and they're carrying it with them, and it gets kind of heavy, right? And perhaps they don't have a tool to take that mental emotional shower, right? To clean away the debris. That is what breathwork does, right? Breathwork knocks out the gatekeeper, opens the door, and lets the junk come out. The amount of times I've had people kind of turn to me after a breathwork session and both tell me and also quite obviously look lighter. They're like, whoa, I just like feel like I put down all this stuff I was carrying. But like their face is brighter, they're sitting taller, there's a change in their skin tone, right? Like it's really incredible to see. You hear people say like, oh, that breathwork session was like 10 years of therapy. Like, what are we referencing if not that I let go of a bunch of baggage that I didn't know I was carrying? Right? So the real kind of power in breathwork lies in both what we covered in part one, right? The kind of restoration of breathing back to an optimal state to give the body the capacity to have energy and to recover. But today we're talking about this kind of transformational piece, which allows us to go in and just shed some of the layers. The layers that many of us carry for a really long time. We're not just talking about the stressful thing that happened last week. It's this shedding and clearing of months, years, decades for some people of stuff that they didn't even know they were carrying, right? This is why people finish breathwork and there's tears, or there's laughter, or there's shaking, or there's trembling, or the jaw, right? We have these releases in the body. And it's so, I led a breathwork session yesterday. This lady was like, I don't know why, but I just feel like crying. I'm not sad, but like my body just wants to cry, and the amount of times I've come out of a breathwork session and there's just tears rolling down my cheeks. And I sometimes jokingly call these laugh tears, right? Like I'm not sad, I'm on the verge of laughing, but I'm crying, and I call it laugh tears, right? It is this shedding, right? This release, this letting go of a lot of the baggage that we're all carrying, the debris, the stuff that just accumulates. Like we don't have to go into the trauma or this is bad or good. Like just like being outside and moving through the world, you pick up a bit of dust and dirt and you need to have a shower, right? They're the same for our psycho-emotional state. Like we just need to have a shower sometimes. You need to wash some of that stuff away. And so when we use breath and typically dive into these kind of longer sessions, this is what's happening, right? The brain is kind of shifting in its activity, less default mode network, less prefrontal cortex, more limbic system, more brainstem. Out comes the stuff, this shedding, and then the body, is going through these almost unwinding processes. You'll see people moving, right? And it is this release of the carried emotion. But the final piece that I think is really incredible when it comes to transformational styles of breathwork is it's not just about what we're letting go of and what we're releasing, but it's also about what we're able to create. What happens when you clear all that noise is the signal becomes clearer again, right? We start to shift into what is possible. What do we want? Who do we want to be, right? This like vision, this deeper sense of kind of identity. Again, the amount of times that after breathwork, people just like, I just felt like so in tune with like what I should be doing, and I know it's not this. I just like, it became so clear to me of like, this is the path that I want to walk down, right? There's this opportunity to tap into without all the baggage, without all the stress, without all the debris and accumulated, like what's possible? What's the vision? Where do I want to go? And it's really interesting because the state that we're in all the time determines the quality of our emotions. It determines the quality of our thoughts, the stories we're telling, and it determines the quality of the kind of vision and the aspirations, right? For someone who's in a cycle of chronic pain or chronic dysfunction of any form, it's very hard to entertain the idea of like, oh yeah, I'm going to like crush my goals and start my new job and like all this amazing stuff, right? Because my present reality is very much kind of like determined by my present experience and my past experience. So like I was in pain yesterday and I was in pain last week and I'm in pain today. I'm probably going to be in pain forever is the mental kind of construct, right? We do breath work and we change the state of consciousness. All of a sudden, that carrot that we dangle at the end of the stick of like the future vision, it's like, I can entertain the idea that maybe I'll be out of pain. What would it look like? What would it feel like? I can entertain the idea of like, achieving these goals that I've set. What would that feel like in my body? And we're not going to go into kind of manifestation, right? There is a lot of the neuroscience side behind that, but shifting the state of consciousness allows us to conjure up different potentials, right? My state is different, which means the emotions I have access to are different, which means the stories I tell and the way I'm thinking are different. And in this, right, we get a glimpse of what's available when we're aligned. I call these peak states, right? P-E-A-K, the peak, right? And I had this beautiful student say, you know what? I think they're peak states, P-E-E-K, right? A peak or a glimpse into what's available in the future. And I love that. Shout out to Rich. When we breathe differently, we create the potential to be different, right? And it's where breath becomes this kind of tool, again, to shed some layers, to create a different future, to liberate and transmute some energy, right? To break the loops, to rewrite the story. And so it's not, again, just this tool of regulation or relaxation, but it's also this really powerful tool when it comes to creating these moments of transformation, these moments of catharsis, these moments of release that have the potential to have a major impact on someone's trajectory. Right? I've seen it again, time and time again. And so whether we see breathwork as this kind of helps me find calm, helps me create capacity, or helps me fuel change, we see why and how breathwork works, right? And the final piece I just want to kind of like zoom in or zoom out, however you look at it here, is the combination of these two things. Part one, restoration, part two, transformation, right? To be able to access these altered states of consciousness, often it is determined by the quality of my breath, the quality of my nervous system, right? Someone who's living in that chronic sympathetic fight, flight, and have been there for a really long time, then going and hyperventilating for 45 minutes to try and access these peak states isn't necessarily going to yield the benefit or the results that they're looking for, right? Because that nervous system doesn't have the capacity, right, to stretch. It doesn't have the capacity for that transformational kind of journey. It's a lot of effort for the body, right? There's no free lunches. And so it's not this question of one or the other, right? We're not saying replace breath work with functional breathing. It's like, but when we stack these two things on top of each other, really interesting things happen, right? We literally rebuild kind of the machinery, the way that the body's working, the patterning, the nervous system. And then we have this massive tool to kind of shape and direct ourselves to a future vision or scenario. I hope this makes sense, right? So if you're a practitioner, if you're an individual, right, breathing, right, is this fundamental tool. It's this fundamental layer. It's the foundation upon which a lot of progress can be built. But both are necessary. Don't dive into the experiential, massive cathartic release sessions if you're still breathing poorly 25,000 times a day, right? And also don't just think that, massaging my diaphragm and breathing better is going to unlock this massive transformation. But stack those two things together and you'll be incredibly surprised at what can happen.